So after my first video, Choose Your Own Crime Stats, which focused on the 50% reduction in violent crime and murder rate in the US over the last 20 years, and then compared the violent crime rate in the US to the UK, some people have asked me, what about comparing the murder rate? So this video is about comparing the murder rate between the US and the UK. We're going to be using the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, which I used in Choose Your Own Crime Stats. We'll also be using the UK Home Office. I want everybody to remember that the UK Home Office only refers to England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland keep their own crime stats. So from here on out, when I refer to the UK, please note that I'm just referring to England and Wales. So let's look at the 2011 murder rates. In the US, the 2011 murder rate was 4.8 per 100,000. The murder rate in the UK was 1.2 per 100,000. So you can see that the US has a murder rate that's 4 times higher than the UK. Now looking at those two numbers, it's easy to make an assumption that, well, the strict gun control in the UK must be working. It's keeping that number low. But if you're trying to assess if the gun control in the UK is working, you shouldn't be comparing their murder rate to ours. You should be comparing it to themselves over a historic period of time. So we're going to be looking at the overall historic murder rate in the UK over the last 100 years. Now we're going to be focusing on murder rate because from a historic point of view, it's very hard to find the murders broken out according to weapons used. So that's why we're focusing on overall murder rate. And I think we can all agree reducing the overall murder rate is something that we want to do, not just focusing on one type of weapon used. So this is the historic murder rate of the UK over the last 100 years. And if we look back at 1910, they had a murder rate of 0.81. And you've seen a slow increase over the last 100 years to 2011, where they have a murder rate of 1.2. So that's a 50% increase over the last 100 years. Now their murder rate did peak in 2003. It peaked at 1.7, and they have seen a small decline. But one thing to notice is that as it's increased over the last 100 years, they've introduced major firearms legislation in 1920, 1937, 1968, 1988, and 1997. After all this firearms legislation has been introduced in the UK, it's virtually impossible to own a gun. You have all handgun bans, and you still have some shotgun and rifles, but you have to have what's called a good reason to own them. And I'll tell you what, in the UK, they consider very few good reasons for you to own a firearm. So despite all of this very strict gun control legislation in the UK, the murder rate has actually still risen over the last 100 years. So while the UK murder rate has been rising over the last 100 years, I'm just kind of curious, what has the US murder rate been doing? So let's first look back at 1910. You'll see the US had a murder rate of 7.9, while the UK murder rate was at 0.81. So before any major gun legislation was put in place, you'll notice the UK still had a lower murder rate than the US. So when you look at both countries' murder rates historically over the last 100 years, you'll realize that the US murder rate has not been following the same trajectory as the UK. When you look at the UK murder rate, it's slowly been rising over the last 100 years. When you look at the US murder rate, it's much more volatile. There's got to be other things at work there that are changing the rate. But one thing to note, we are down 40% from our 1910 murder rate. We are almost down to the historic lows that we saw in the 1950s. So recently here in the US, we've been having what I think is a very important conversation on how to reduce our murder rate, how to reduce our violent crime. And part of the solutions offered to this problem have been increased gun control. And I think it's really important to look at some examples of gun control and how well they've worked. So when you look at the UK historically, someplace that has strict gun control, the murder rate actually hasn't decreased, it's actually increased. So when our policymakers are out there trying to gather all the facts and do their due diligence, I mean, surely they would look at this data. I mean, they wouldn't promote a policy that they don't think it's going to work. I mean, would they?
What we're going to do is going to fundamentally alter or eliminate the possibility of another mass shooting or guarantee that we will bring gun deaths down to 1,000 a year from what it is now.
So if our policymakers don't think gun control is going to work, then why are we wasting our time? I mean, shouldn't we be focused on gathering all the facts and understanding the circumstances that violent crime and murder are born out of? Wouldn't that be the best place to spend our time so we could actually come up with real solutions that are going to solve our problems?